Hey everyone, Catherine Matthijs-Sundell with Civility Partners. Great to see you today on video. I know I send out a lot of written e-newsletters, but it's nice to show my face every now and again. Today we are with Petra, and Petra, you're going to have to say your last name for me.
That's fine. It's Velzeboer.
Velzeboer. All right. So Petra and I met at a conference. We were both speakers, and we got to talking at lunchtime around culture. And she overheard me talking about bullying and how I really see that as an organizational culture problem, and that's how I tackle workplace bullying. And it turns out that Petra has her own niche around mental health in the workplace and really uses organizational culture and tackling that in her business too. So we had a lot in common in terms of how we view the world and how we view organizations. So Petra, I'd love to just have you go ahead and introduce yourself first. Tell us a little bit about you and a little bit about your journey and how you ended up getting into what you do.
Sure. So I'm based in London. I'm a mental health consultant. So as you said, I work with businesses to help them think about mental health in the workplace. But our definition around that is very much around how we all have mental health, just like we have physical health. So like focusing on the health word, because so often we go straight into mental health means mental illness. And what we're really trying to do is help businesses think from a prevention perspective. Like, how do we, in a world of technology and disconnection, just connect, and how this enhances productivity, how we can support each other. And I've got a clinical background, so I'm a psychotherapist and executive coach. And it's also a training company. So we do loads of sort of mental health for leaders, empathy and emotional intelligence. That I'm probably like you, I wear lots of different hats, but there's the small insight.
Yeah, okay. So I know one thing we talked about at lunch at that conference is that how the UK views mental health and even mental illness, which, as we're learning, is different than mental health. You said the UK really seems to view it very differently than the United States. So I'm curious to hear more about that. How is it different in the UK?
I mean, even in the UK, there's like a continuum, right, of some companies who are really looking to innovate in this space and to really, and I imagine in the US, there's something similar where there's some companies that are very corporate and old school and others that are innovating more in that team and leadership space. But definitely at our conference, I spoke to lots of people, and it was almost like I was speaking a different language to lots of people. How focusing on employee well-being, happiness, fulfillment, all those sorts of things can enhance productivity. So I think in the last year or two, we've just built a lot of momentum in the UK. Part of that is the Royals have been talking about it. There's been lots of campaigns around mental health in general, but specifically in the workplace. And in the last year, two very significant reports have come out. One is called the Thriving at Work report by Stevenson Farmer, and the other one is called Seizing the Momentum, which came this year shortly afterwards. And in there, there's loads of statistics and financial arguments, the business case for why looking after your people and investing in them makes good business sense. And so there's calculations around how not doing that means you end up spending more on the crisis end. I do think that the systems are somewhat different. So because there might be different sort of benefits over here, what I noticed in my little bit of research in the States was the fear element of if you say the wrong thing, there could be a litigation process. You guys love suing people, right? People, whereas here we'll do management training and say, what are your fears when thinking about this stuff? And the fears might be, it's going to take up too much time. They're worried they won't know what to say and that it will be sort of a Pandora's box thing. So I think some of that is similar, but it feels like there's another layer for you guys of just fear that literally, if you say the wrong thing, to just have a bit of empathy and look out for someone, it could be misconstrued. You've got the whole Me Too movement that's just making people extremely worried and afraid. But some of these simple recommendations can really alter the culture of an organization.
What are some of your simple recommendations? Give us two or three. What are some simple things? And then I want to come back to some of the things that you had just
Yeah.
talked about. But give us a couple of those recommendations.
So there's 6 very specific ones in the Thriving at Work report, and we can send you that link to send out to your
Please.
email network, because just the exact summary of it would be really useful as a guide.
Okay,
But in
please
those
do.
recommendations, it's produce, implement a mental health at work plan. So have some kind of strategy around the initiatives and the maybe special interest days that people might do, but really create a coherent plan. Develop mental health awareness among employees, which could look like training, but also how do we just talk to each other again and support each other, not just from a hierarchy perspective, but as people who deserve to enjoy their work and can be their most productive when they do. And then there's 6 of them, but the other one that I find quite interesting and work with leaders quite a lot on is encourage open conversations about mental health at work and the support available for people. So as you can imagine, that one seems both vague and specific,
Yeah.
because well, what does that actually mean? What does it look like in a work context? And what are the fears or the barriers that might stop people from having that sort of open conversation?
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. I definitely think here mental health is still sort of taboo. We have a lot of stuff around work-life balance, which leans into mental health a little bit. That if you make room for people to spend time with their family, or if you have a stressful work environment, that they are allowed to step away, maybe, or I don't know about the UK, but in the US, it's a big trend right now to have kind of living room setups, and so maybe that will help people relax a little bit. But mental illness falls under our Americans with Disabilities Act, and I was talking with my husband this morning, as does pregnancy. You get pregnancy disability leave, so there's these things that happen that the law classifies as disability, and I think that's a real paradigm problem that needs shifting. But of course, changing the law is a big process. And I'm here in California, where our laws are just millions of times more difficult to navigate than any other state in the United States.
Really?
And so, yeah, especially lately, our Governor Brown just signed, I think it was like 103 new laws related to employment, and just made everything tighter, and everybody's kind of walking around on eggshells. So I know there's a real fear on HR's part, probably telling managers, don't bring up mental health or illness unless the employee does, and that's not good. So,
But just the fact that it's under a disability heading gives us this whole negative context. And
yep.
and in some of the training that we do, we show what physical health is often viewed like in the media, for example, which is very aspirational. It's cool outfits, it's muscles, it's winning, it's victory, it's failing fast and winning anyway, that sort of context. And then if you flip that to the media's representation of mental health, noting that they both have health in the title, it's all
Mm-hmm.
like despair, head in our hands, losing, being weak, that sort of thing. And so we're trying to change the narrative to make mental health aspirational as well. So when you have a winning mindset, you can be successful in your career. When you look out for each other and do the things that you're saying, time with family, meditation, exercise, look after your physical health, that this can enhance all the other aspects of sustaining you long term in the workforce.
Yeah, that's a great point. So tell us a little bit about how you work with clients. I'm curious to understand that more. So a client, how do they find you, or what inspires them to go looking for someone like you? And tell us a little bit about what you do when you're working with
Sure.
clients.
Um, so it really depends. So if we're working with some kind of the startups or the newer organizations with a younger workforce who are already passionate and quite open about these sorts of topics, we'll just kind of do an audit or an assessment about where they're at and what the culture is like already as far as language and conversation and support. The HR guys might know what the support is, and then I'm always curious to, does the guy on the front line, the most junior person, know what support is out there? And equally, does the manager have the phone number of the employee assistance program or whatever benefit system there might be? Do they have it in their phones? We do a bit of an audit. But so the way in there is very much they're talking about mental health and saying, what do we need to do to get to the next level of innovation? And that could be something like a training program. It could be the sixth recommendation in this report is monitoring mental health and well-being in the workplace. So that can look like lots of different things, adding a couple of questions into engagement surveys, but mostly possibly creating a mental health ambassador program where you've got key people within the organization at different levels who have a more intensive training and support, but really from a light perspective. I know that sounds like it's counterintuitive, but we're talking about how do we connect and talk to each other and look after our physical health and normalize conversations about mental health. The other thing is 1 in 4 of us, that's the statistic here in the UK, will experience a mental health condition in our lifetime. And I think that's rising. 70% more children and young people are experiencing depression. The World Health Organization says depression is going to be the top level of issue of disability by the year 2020. So this isn't like a niche category down at the crisis end. It influences all of us everywhere. The other way in with sort of older school companies such as construction or even financial services is through their health and safety model. So they have traditionally looked at the safety element in great detail, so many processes and policies around making sure no accidents take place. And they're really trying to change that lens to focus on the health aspect as well, including mental health. So that kind of is another way in. They're saying, how do we get really robust using those sorts of policies, but make them come alive and adapt to the times?
Yeah, okay. I'm interested in this topic because you are fabulous to talk to and you have a lot of interesting things to say, but also as somebody who focuses on toxic work environments, certainly I see a lot of trauma in my work where I go in, I get reactive phone calls. The culture's been festering for a while and something happens and then they call and seek my help to kind of be normal again. And definitely if things have been allowed to go on for a long time, like sexual harassment or bullying, then there is a lot of sort of traumatized people who are at the receiving end. And sometimes I even see even people who didn't know about the stuff that was happening and we're just thinking all was good. They're sort of traumatized by the news, of my climate survey that this is really a big problem. And so you've definitely got me thinking through how I can start to incorporate more mental health into my work that I'm doing as part of my culture change process. So for example, one client right now, we're looking at trying to get maybe someone who specializes in trauma to come in and help people heal a little bit. And that's a big part of the process that they're going through. But as I talk about engagement and all these things I talk about, mental health is something I haven't necessarily touched on, but that certainly is an important part. I think work is a big part of our self-concept and self-esteem, so you have to feel good there, but your employer has to support your mental health all the way around. So I think this is important.
You need the people at the top buying in, and where it works really well is where we've got our top CEOs, we've got our C-suite of directors talking to their people openly about their own mental health. And so there's lots around vulnerability. Brené Brown does amazing research around the topics in the workplace. And where it works the best strategically and long-term is where you've got the business buy-in, you've got the people at the top, not just saying, you should go and do this, but actually living it themselves. It just makes such a profound difference. And you're doing many of these things already, which is why we got into our conversation, because I was like, it's very similar with a different sort of headline. But on the trauma piece, any of our training is about the organizational responsibility, but it's also about our personal responsibility. How do we look after our own mental health on a day-to-day basis? Like you said, we've got the news feed constantly on, we've got our phones, we've got notifications. And what essentially we're doing is we're constantly in fight or flight, right? We're constantly reacting to an outside stimulus. And whereas before it might have been, not that frequently that you'd have that sort of stimulus right in front of you, these days, there could be a war or something on the other side of the world, and we're constantly being affected. So there's some tools and tips just from that personal perspective of how do we take our own breaks. I sort of manage my media intake, and we've got to consciously think about how we do things if we're going to manage how it affects us, because not making a decision in that area in this day and age is making a decision. It affects us, right?
Yeah, yeah. So you're saying we should really be aware of limiting our social media or how much we're taking in, how much news we're
What
taking
is
in,
it?
setting some guidelines for ourselves about what we're taking in.
100%. What's the content we're consuming? What are we liking and watching? And what's the effect on our mood, our state of mind, our ability to be empathetic, to support people, all that sort of thing. And the other, you can tell I could talk about this all day. I'm going to stop.
Yeah, that's good. That's good stuff.
Um, Brené Brown also says it's hard to hate people up close, and often in workplace politics, and not to mention politics. You guys have a lot of that going on. But there's so much divide, right, between how people feel, but they're often in their own silos, reinforcing their behaviors and their belief systems. Whereas if we actually just step out of our silos for a minute and connect, which is some of the stuff we do in our training, it's really hard to hate someone up close, and we begin to break down the walls in that connection space.
I like that quote, and that speaks to how easy it is to bully someone online or make negative comments when you're commenting on someone's random blog post, things you probably wouldn't say to their face because it's hard to hate someone up close. That's a great point. I want to see what other questions I had for you. I had created some, but we've had some good conversations here. So tell me about key components of an organizational culture. So we talked about, for example, the leaders at the top have to be vulnerable if they're going to make room for employees to feel comfortable to be vulnerable. What are some of those other sort of organizational action items that would be in a culture change process? Obviously, training from you would be an important piece of that too. Can you give us a couple other kind of specific action items from a cultural standpoint that organizations should focus on?
Yeah, I think it's some of the structural stuff. What do your policies reflect? Are your managers trained up in their performance reviews? Do they understand that empathy is also coupled with boundaries? It's not just, there's this misconception that having empathy and trying to connect means we're all doing fluffy things and hugging, and you guys can't hug over there, but and
Nope. No
nope,
touching.
no touching, touch, and getting emotional and not getting any work done, right? When the reality is, a lot of our training is how do you have a firm boundary and you can, with kindness and empathy, say things that might be quite difficult to hear. There's also what I was surprised at in my little bit of research at that conference, because I kept saying, if people go to HR, what's the support that's in place there? And the room was saying, we wouldn't go to HR for this. Like going to HR is like going to the principal's office. It's like, that's not the place we go. And I was quite surprised by that. I mean, I get that HR has an employment law and their function, and that their role is to look out for the best interests of the company. But at the same time, in many companies here, HR or head of people or those sorts of titles, they are the people that you would go to over here for something. I'm struggling with a divorce, or I've just lost my brother in an accident, or it's the stuff, the outside circumstances that could affect how we feel at work. And there would be less fear in many companies that would be a catalyst to be gotten rid of, or that's what I mean about the sort of fear. But over here, what we try and do is that mental health awareness has gone up, and so has managers just saying, go speak to HR, because they should be skilled or know about this stuff. They're often not clinically trained. They could be quite young or quite a small team, and now are inundated with all this openness, right? So some of our training and support is to create structural changes, giving them the skills to empower the managers and the leaders to be able to manage their people, not just from a target perspective, but from an emotional support perspective as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. HR is my people. That's who I'm around a lot, and who, when I speak at conferences, that's who I'm speaking to. And I've definitely found that I feel like there are two kinds of HR people. There are the culture, the people type of HR professionals, and then there's the real compliance focused HR professionals. And so I think if somebody is feeling like they're frustrated from a divorce, or feeling sad about something, or any problems that they're going through, you have to kind of assess what kind of HR person do we have here in this company. Are they a people and culture person? And if they are, that individual would be more likely to take a different type of approach versus, yeah, HR is supposed to manage the laws. So I believe there are probably many organizations where, you're feeling sad, maybe you need a break because something going on in your personal life, or you're feeling too stressed. And if you go to HR and say those things, they'll probably hand you the corporate policy and tell you, well, you can file a workers' comp, or something, and just kind of put this employee down that route of, well, what are my legal liabilities here as your HR manager, as opposed to how can I help you. So big tip for today for all my HR e-news readers is that as HR, we all really need to educate ourselves on how to talk to somebody who's talking about these types of things, and how do you give them some empathy, and can you talk to them without going straight to well, let's look at our ADA policy. I think that's
Yeah,
what people are afraid of.
have a little bit of a buffer, right, of
Yeah,
humanity. And of course, that's still your role, or you need to be able to look at those things. But I think there's a way that we can do difficult things that can support, even if you're supporting a person out of the company. It's like we can be lifting people up and playing our part to make the world better, rather than just doing our job and just kind of making it worse for people.
yeah. And I see that with the harassment and the bullying. Here in the United States, bullying is legal, technically. Equal opportunity harassment is legal. But if you harass or bully someone based on a protected characteristic, then that is illegal. So I definitely have come across many HR professionals and many targets who have said, I've talked to HR, and there are many HR people out there who kind of go, well, what I'm hearing about doesn't sound illegal, so you'll just have to get back to work. Or, the manager kind of has that same reaction. I don't know what to do with this information when you say that your team member rolls your eyes. It sounds like a personal issue you guys have, so go deal with it. And yeah, so
Imagine,
really developing that empathy would be good.
yeah, and imagine how much you could avoid that really messy crisis end of,
Hmm.
enacting some of these more harsher policies, if you had that little bit of a buffer of conversation, leadership, supporting people to give them a chance, right? But when we
Yep.
ignore it, or we make it worse, or we just say, get on with it, we end up having more and more people down that end where you need to have put those policies in place that can just feel really difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my own personal story is that I was bullied, and I talked to my leader about it a lot. And he would just say, oh, that's just how he is. Get over it. It's fine. Don't let it bother you. And I'm kept telling him it is bothering me. And I got to a point where I was pretty depressed. It was pretty hard to get to work in the morning. I was late a lot towards the end of that. And I would say I was fairly depressed. I was just sick of being abused, and having to be the buffer because I was the HR person there. And yeah, so I really went down a path that could have been solved if the behavior had been resolved a lot earlier on. So, well, thank you so much for all of your insight. Any sort of final tips or thoughts for our listeners, our watchers, who are mostly organizational leaders, managers, HR? Final thought.
I think it is possible to create organizational and cultural change. I know that each person listening to this will have been impacted by mental health at some point in their life, whether it was a friend, a family member, a colleague, someone that they've worked with, or themselves. And so this is a conversation that relates to everyone. It is possible to begin shining that light within your company, because this conversation affects everything. It affects bullying, it affects leadership, it affects so many different facets. And I'll pass on these two reports so that people, because they've got some real clear recommendations, but also statistics, many of which that I think will translate to the issues that you're seeing over there. So we'll pass that on.
Yes, please. We'll stick those in the e-newsletter when we send out the link. So your email address and website is there on the slide, but I know you speak a lot, and I think you've written some books. So tell us about some of the other ways we can get in touch with you or learn about your methods and thoughts on all of this.
Sure, absolutely. Drop me an email if you have a particular issue that you'd like some advice on. My website is there, consultancy, training, keynote speaking. And the keynote speaking in the States is really around mental health innovation. It feels like some of the stuff that we're doing here is quite revolutionary in certain aspects over there. So if you need a bit of an inspirational and practical guide to what is possible with some case studies, sort of get in touch, and my contact details are there. So I'd love to hear from you.
I love that. Yeah. So reach out to Petra if you want to hear about what the UK is doing. It sounds like they're farther along on this topic than we are, and Petra's got some great ideas. So thanks again, Petra, for joining us, and we really appreciate it. And bye, everyone.
Thank you.